They called it the most magical show on Earth. Orcas soaring through the air, trainers ride them like kings of the sea. Families cheered, children screamed, cameras flashed. We didn't see the cracks. We didn't hear the panic underwater. We only saw the splash zone. SeaWorld sold a dream for years that humans and killer whales could perform in harmony. That captivity wasn't cruelty, it was care. That Tilikum, the largest orca in captivity, was just another part of the spectacle. But behind the music and lights, someone had already died, and it was only a matter of time before it happened again. When the truth surfaced, it didn't come from SeaWorld. It came from a documentary they never wanted you to see. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a cover-up, a company built on silence, a story they spent decades trying to bury. Before the protests, before the documentaries, the headlines, the blood, there was only applause. SeaWorld ran like a dream, smooth, polished, unchallenged. Trainers danced with orcas under spotlights. The animals had names. The crowd never questioned why something wild would perform on command. The company had the timing down to a science. The splash, the music, the myth. Every moment is choreographed. What people saw was wonder. What they didn't see, that's where we begin. He was never born into captivity. He was taken off the coast of Iceland, 1983. Hunters chased his pod into a narrow bay surrounded by steep cliffs. Nets dropped from boats, engines roared. The youngest were taken, the adults were set free because they weren't worth as much. Tilikum was 2 years old, small enough to move, valuable enough to keep. They lifted him from the sea in a sling and raised him into the air, then flew him across the world. His mother followed the boat until the engine faded. He never saw her again. He spent his first years at Sealand of the Pacific, a marine park in British Columbia. It was a concrete pool behind a chain-link fence. He was kept with 2 older females. Both were dominant, both were territorial. They scratched him with their teeth, drove him to the bottom, denied him food. At night, he was locked in a floating metal box, a holding pen, barely large enough to turn around. Hours in total darkness, still water, no escape. Trainers said it was for safety, but Tilikum wasn't safe. He was isolated, silent, learning. They fed him when he obeyed, ignored him when he didn't, and he adapted because he had to. During the day, he performed in choreographed routines for crowds of tourists, jumping, spinning, splashing on cue. In February 1991, the routine broke. Trainer Kelty Byrne slipped into the pool after a show. 3 whales were in the water. Tilikum was one of them. She tried to climb out. They pulled her back, again and again. By the time help arrived, it was too late. She drowned in front of the staff. No footage, no recordings, just witness accounts, and 1 dead trainer. Nobody could say who delivered the fatal blow, but Tilikum was the largest, the only male, and the one with value. Sealand shut down. Tilikum was supposed to be returned to the wild. Instead, he was sent to SeaWorld. They called it a new chapter, a fresh start. Florida, new trainers, new routines, a bigger stage, a larger tank. It's still a cage. No one talked about Sealand. No one talked about Kelty. Tilikum was treated like a clean slate, but he remembered everything. They didn't remove him. They repurposed him, gave him a new schedule, a new spotlight, and later, they bred him with other females to create more whales like him. More whales, more revenue, more control. The aggression didn't vanish, it went quiet, until the day it didn't. The gates opened every morning, the shows went on, and from the outside, nothing looked wrong. Tilikum was still performing. He no longer swam beside trainers, they kept their distance, gave him solo cues. He'd rise from the water on command, circle the tank, roar on cue, return to holding. Guests watched from the stands, unaware he spent most of his life alone. SeaWorld called it standard procedure, behavioral management, but behind the glass, trainers were growing uneasy. He showed signs of decline, worn down teeth from biting the steel bars that lined his pool, slow, aimless circles. Sometimes he just floated still for hours. He'd been in captivity for over a decade. His muscles had weakened. His dorsal fin collapsed, permanently folded to one side, a known sign of stress. There were no toys, no challenges, no real social bonds, only isolation, repetition, and the occasional show. For a whale that used to swim 100 miles a day was now drifting in circles 30 feet across. Then came July 1999. The morning crew found something in Tilikum's pool. It was another body. 27-year-old Daniel Dukes had snuck into the park after hours. Security was light. The tanks were unguarded. Somehow, he made it past the barriers. He was found draped across Tilikum's back, naked, bruised, bitten. His skin was torn. The official cause of death was drowning. There were no witnesses, no cameras, just speculation and damage control. SeaWorld framed it as a trespassing tragedy. They released a statement suggesting drugs, mental instability, and personal recklessness. They never called it a risk. They never called it a pattern. Tilikum stayed in the show. He was too valuable to stop. By then, he'd already fathered multiple calves through artificial insemination, a living asset, a breeding machine. Trainers moved him between pools to manage his behavior, but the stress never left. He still showed signs of aggression, lunging, snapping, refusing to perform. The trainers closest to him started asking questions. Some were ignored, some were reassigned, others left quietly. What they saw wasn't rebellion, it was a burnout in the whales, in themselves. They weren't just working with animals, they were managing trauma. Inside SeaWorld, silence was policy. No one mentioned the body, not in meetings, not on training platforms. There were no updated protocols, no internal memos, no sign that anything had changed. The man was dead, the whale was performing, the park was open. From the stands, everything looked normal, but a man had died, and SeaWorld kept going. No announcements, no changes, no accountability. And deep in the tank, Tilikum was still waiting. Not for freedom, for the next victim. February 24th, 2010. This time, the guests were seated at tables beside the tank. The program was called Dine with Shamu, a lunchtime add-on where families ate their meals while trainers worked with orcas just feet away. It was designed to feel personal, casual, safe. Dawn Blanchell stood at the center of it all. She had been with SeaWorld for over 15 years, senior trainer, mentor, media favorite. Her image was in brochures, commercials, and billboards. She knew the whales by heart, especially Tilikum. They had a long history. She understood his signals, his moods, his limitations. He was no longer used in waterwork, no more dives, no more rides. But he still performed. Controlled movements, surface behaviors. That afternoon, Dawn ran through the routine. Standard interactions, hand cues, food rewards. Then the cooldown. She lowered herself beside the pool, her arm extended. Her ponytail rested behind her. Tilikum moved toward her slowly. Then, without warning, he surged upward. He grabbed her. In an instant, she was in the water. The attack began immediately. Tilikum thrashed her, dragged her, pulled her deeper with every turn. Guests watched in silence, then in horror. Some thought it was part of the program. Then they heard the yelling. Staff rushed in. They triggered alarms, threw nets and distraction tools in the water, tried to issue commands, but there was no procedure for this. Not with Tilikum, not at this scale. He kept her under for 45 minutes, refused to surface, refused to release her. He swam circles with her body in his mouth. When they finally retrieved her, the scene was unimaginable. The autopsy listed the facts. Blunt force trauma, fractured ribs, a shattered jaw, her spinal cord had been broken, her left arm was torn from the socket, the scalp was missing. A gruesome torture death. This was the most experienced trainer SeaWorld had. She followed protocol, she knew the risks, and she died anyway. The stadium was cleared, the show was cancelled, the body was gone. Tilikum stayed in the pool. Inside the park, no one spoke his name, but outside, the story was spreading, and this time, people were listening. The headlines hit fast. Trainer killed by killer whale during show. Third death linked to same orca. New vans lined the gates outside SeaWorld Orlando. Cameras caught staff slipping through side doors. executives moved behind closed ones. SeaWorld issued its first statement that afternoon. They called Dawn a beloved team member, a veteran, and a role model, said she was doing what she loved, that she knew the risks, that it was a heartbreaking day for the SeaWorld family. They didn't name Tilikum. They didn't mention his past. No one had to, because the press was already digging. The facts didn't come from SeaWorld's website. They came from court records, old tax filings, archived reports, and buried inside, Tilikum, tied to a disturbing legacy SeaWorld never disclosed. Bits of footage began to surface, a tourist's video, shaky and chaotic, screaming, trainers running across slick concrete. It didn't show the moment Dawn died, but it showed enough to raise questions, enough to reveal SeaWorld wasn't telling everything. The media moved in, local, national, international. Everyone wanted answers. SeaWorld offered silence. Then, the former trainers started speaking. John Hargrove, a senior trainer who had worked closely with Tilikum, Carol Ray, a former supervisor at SeaWorld, Jeffrey Ventura, a SeaWorld veteran, was dismissed after questioning policy. They started speaking on camera, in interviews, in documentaries. They described what it looked like behind the music and the splash zone. Whales with broken teeth from chewing metal grates, dorsal fins collapsed from years of floating in shallow water, isolation tanks where the animals had no stimulation, no space to dive, and nothing to hear but their own breathing. They spoke of internal pressure, of warnings ignored, of a company that valued obedience over safety, and silence over truth. SeaWorld dismissed them, said they hadn't worked with the animals in years, said their protocols were sound, said the animals were well cared for, but the public wasn't buying it. The cracks weren't in the tanks, they were in the story. And while SeaWorld tried to hold the narrative together, someone, somewhere, had already begun pulling the thread. It started with a case file. After Dawn Branchow's death, federal investigators arrived at SeaWorld Orlando. The Occupation Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, launched a formal inquiry. They pulled safety protocols, interviewed staff, subpoenaed performance logs, veterinary records, and years of internal reports. What they found went far beyond a single tragedy. Tilikum had been flagged for years. Trainers had logged his unpredictability, sudden refusals, missed cues, lunges at platforms. Supervisors knew the risks, but Tilikum stayed in shows and in the breeding program. His sperm was worth millions. Removing him meant explaining why. SeaWorld fought back. They hired lawyers, disputed OSHA's findings, insisting they had never knowingly put anyone in danger. But in 2012, the ruling came down. SeaWorld was found guilty of willful safety violations. They had exposed trainers to recognized hazards likely to cause death or serious physical harm. The fine was just $75,000. But the word willful was everything. It meant they knew and chose to continue anyway. SeaWorld appealed, claimed the risks were unforeseeable, but under oath, more cracks emerged. Internal emails, incident reports, medical records. What had once been dismissed as opinion was now an official record. And while the investigation played out, a man had already done the work. Journalist Tim Zimmerman published The Killer in a Pool, a 10,000-word exposé in Outside magazine. For many, it was the first time they learned Tilikum had been involved in multiple deaths. Zimmerman traced it all. The capture in Iceland, the metal box at Sealand, the drowning of Kelty Burn, the silence that followed. He named names, backed every detail with records, and laid the foundation for what came next. Because The Killer in the Pool became the spine of a film, Zimmerman worked with the filmmakers, connecting dots, building timelines, sharing documents. The documentary took a year to complete, but when it aired, it turned a tragedy into a reckoning, a film built from silence and titled after what SeaWorld once called its stars, Blackfish. When it aired on CNN in primetime,
for a dead person at SeaWorld, a whale has eaten one of the trainers.
Over 21 million people watched, and the fallout was immediate. SeaWorld's attendance dropped by nearly 1 million visitors the following year. Then came the earnings call. Wall Street listened in, and when SeaWorld tried to reassure investors, the market answered. In a single day, the company's stock plummeted, 33% gone, just like that. By the end of 2014, SeaWorld had lost over $830 million in shareholder value. The lawsuits followed. Multiple class action claims accused the company of deception, downplaying the documentary's impact, hiding the long-term damage to the brand. Then came a separate federal investigation, this time by the SEC. It wasn't about safety, it was about fraud. SeaWorld had told investors that Blackfish hadn't hurt business, that attendance was steady, that the backlash was overblown. But behind the scenes, they were losing millions. The SEC launched an inquiry to determine if SeaWorld had knowingly concealed its financial losses to protect its stock price. They reviewed internal emails, earnings reports, executive communications. In 2017, SeaWorld and its former CEO agreed to pay $5 million to settle the charges. They didn't admit guilt, they didn't deny it either. Then came the damage control. Full-page newspaper ads, TV commercials defending their animal care, glossy websites packed with curated facts. But the message had already changed hands. SeaWorld no longer controlled the story. The public did. Performers cancelled concerts, sponsors pulled out, schools cut ties, politicians called for reform. And in 2016, SeaWorld made a quiet, permanent shift. They ended their orca breeding program. The shows would continue, but no new whales, no more calves, no replacements. There was no press conference, no trainer in a wetsuit beside a podium, just a statement posted online. A year later, in January 2017, Tilikum died. He had spent more than 3 decades in captivity. He was believed to be 36 years old. SeaWorld said it was a bacterial lung infection. There was no public memorial, no marker, no remains. The orca died the way he lived, inside, out of sight, managed behind glass. After that, SeaWorld rebranded. They replaced shows with experiences, painted the tanks, softened the music, added conservation talking points to the script. But the tanks didn't change, the size didn't change, the silence didn't change. What changed was belief. The illusion had shattered, and for the first time in decades, the world stopped clapping. SeaWorld is still open. The whales are still inside. There are no rescue plans, no retirement sanctuaries, only new attractions, new slogans, and a public that moved on faster than they should have. The business recovered. The animals never did. What began as a show became a secret. What ended as a scandal revealed something deeper. This wasn't a story about one whale, or one death, or one company. It was about what happens when profit is built on silence, when suffering is repackaged as a spectacle. Some say it's over, that the worst has passed, things are different now. But the tanks are still full, and the story still echoes, not because we watched it happen, but because for too long we didn't.